Kyrgyzstan, the land that's Kyrgyzstan today, was already quite developed and quite densely populated in the south by the 17th, 18th century. The Fergana Valley especially had a mix of Turkic peoples, a lot of Uzbek tribes who had settled in the region, joined a number of Persian peoples, and it was one of the Silk Road territories. So it had always been a route between Europe and Asia, rich bazaars, and by the 17th, 18th century, you started to get a very large cotton trade in the region with the British and India. There was a demand for cotton that was being grown there, and then trade started to increase again after some dips after the Mongol invasion in the 14th, 15th centuries. So that was a very developed area and settled area. Then around that, you got a lot of ethnic Kyrgyz, and these were people who came in the 16th, 17th centuries, tribes from Siberia, and started to settle around the region in confederations, were horse riders and bred sheep. And there was a very complicated dynamic that they had with the settled population. So you had a mix of settled and nomadic peoples in the region around that time. When the Russians came into the region, it was about the mid-19th century. So you already did have this very developed population and a pretty strong dynamic between the settled peoples and the nomadic peoples. Trade on the one hand, which was quite positive, but then lots of raids and conflict on the other. At the beginning, the Tsarist government just decided to categorize these people as settled and nomads, which was more or less how they saw themselves. But you did have, by the late 19th century, a number of ethnographers from Russia coming in with very European ideas of nationality. And they thought, well, you classify people by the language they speak, by the territory they occupy, by even things like the culture they have and the clothes they wear. So they went through and started to look into historical patterns in the region and found these names, Uzbek, Kyrgyz, Kazakh, Turkmen, that people hadn't actually used since the 15th, 16th century, and resurrected them and said, well, if you wear this kind of clothing and you speak this Turkic language, you're an Uzbek and you live on this territory. And so you started to get this becoming the language in the Tsarist government. And then people of the region themselves also took it up, because in the Muslim world in the 19th century, there was a lot of anxiety over why are we being conquered by the Europeans so easily. And perhaps organizing themselves into modern nations with actually European criteria might help them organize themselves a bit better. So there's this coming together of a sense that we need to find a new way to categorize and organize ourselves. Part of the Tsarist mechanic was also a sense to divide these people a little bit, to say, well, we don't want them to all think of themselves just as Muslim and become one Muslim force against us. If we have a sense that we're dividing them up, that might be a little positive. But by the end of the Tsarist period already, you start to get people beginning, really just the elites beginning to feel that, well, maybe I am an Uzbek or maybe I am a Tajik. And then in the early 20th century, you start to get massive Russian settlement into the region. The Russians are trying to get rid of all their problem citizens. They have too many peasants who are likely to rebel. They already rebelled in 1905. And they come in, and this is the first time in the Kyrgyz areas where the average Kyrgyz person is going to run into Russian settlers. And there's a lot of violence. And actually in 1916, during World War I, there was a massive rebellion in Kyrgyzstan, or the lands that are Kyrgyzstan today, against Russian settlement. And you actually had Kyrgyz armies of 40,000 horse-led tribesmen attacking Russian villages. And the Russians who were fighting World War I at the time had to recall about 9 divisions of troops to put down this rebellion in Central Asia, and actually about hundreds, well, we don't know, but hundreds of thousands of Kazakhs and Kyrgyz were fled across the border to China. So there was this mix of a sense that we're not Russians and we need to be something else, and also among the elites a sense that European nationality was, national categories were really important to them. Well, the Soviets were actually quite sincere at the beginning about trying to modernize these peoples and trying to give them a unique identity and trying to actually reverse Russian colonialism. They were Marxists, and they thought that the Russian settlers were the bourgeois and they had repressed these peoples. But they also believed in European ideas of nationality, and their sense was, well, what we do is we take these tribal peoples, so-called backward peoples, give them European national categories, modernize them, get them to read, because 95% of the population was illiterate, in these national languages that they would create. So there was another wave of ethnographers that came down in the early 1920s and started to talk to some of these elites who were already thinking in national categories and trying to decide, okay, let's carve out some nations in this region that we can then Sovietize. And so you'd have national content, but socialism in national form, but socialism in content. So in the early 1920s, there was this really broad process of negotiation. The Kyrgyz were actually the last to the table. A lot of this were power plays, and Uzbek elites were far more established, and they said, well, we want Uzbekistan to have this territory. And the Kazakh elites were saying, we want the Kazakhs to have this territory. There was really no such category as Kyrgyz defined nationally until about 1920, when people were saying, well, Kyrgyz are different than Kazakhs because Kazakhs are in the plains and Kyrgyz are in the mountains. And so we want our own separate mountain territory. But then the people who were saying, well, Kyrgyzstan needs its own territory, said, well, we want a mountain territory, but we also need to have some fertile land as well to become a viable unit. And the question was the Fergana Valley, which I talked about earlier, which was this very densely populated, very rich agricultural land. And there was this massive fight in the boardrooms between everybody trying to convince Moscow, the Uzbeks, the Kazakhs, and the Kyrgyz, and the Tajiks too, which were the Persian-speaking peoples in the south, who gets what cities in the Fergana Valley. The Uzbeks probably won out. They got Bukhara and Samarkand from the Tajiks, which weren't necessarily Fergana Valley cities, and then extended out to Tashkent and Osh, and Andijan and Fergana. Osh was the one city that the Kyrgyz got because there were a large number of Kyrgyz tribesmen around it. So they did get that patch of Fergana Valley. And then Kyrgyzstan did have its own territorial unity between north and south. And the Soviets were quite careful to foster that and to tell people you were Kyrgyz. Now, it's quite difficult because most of these people in the Fergana Valley didn't consider themselves Uzbeks or Tajiks or Kyrgyz. They identified with their village, with their families. All of a sudden, the government is coming in and saying, this village here is Uzbek, there's a border, and you guys are Kyrgyz. Now, in the Soviet period, the borders didn't mean a lot, but they did have political consequences, because if you were Kyrgyz, that meant your privileges were in your own republic, in Bishkek, which was 11 hours away, instead of across the river where your friends and your family members were. So it was this very complicated process, and you still, today in the Fergana Valley, it's a real issue that these people have all this mixture of older identities and newer identities together, which has made it a little bit unstable. The idea that ethnicity had a national basis and that you needed to have territories was starting to become more and more defined in the early 1920s, when there was a sense that and Stalin was actually a leader in this. He was the one who took the head of the Nationalities Commission at this point. And it was his very firm belief that each nationality, each ethnic group had to be a nationality, had to have a territory that it owned. So this territorial principle was what the planners were operating under. So the Uzbeks and the Kyrgyz and the Kazakhs and the Turkmen, these elites, had a say into saying, okay, we want this versus that territory. But the principle of this had actually come down from Moscow, that every nation should have its own territory and should then become separate from the other and completely distinct with its own culture, its own language, its own ways of life. The popularization of memory and history in Kyrgyzstan really occurred after the Second World War, when Kyrgyz historians operating under Soviet guidelines, under a mass education system, started to publish histories of Kyrgyzstan. And parallel to that, there were Uzbek historians who did histories of Uzbekistan and histories of Tajikistan. And each people had its own history that was rooted to that territory. And it actually meant a little bit of fudging of history. So as I had mentioned in an earlier question, the Kyrgyz were tribes that had come from Siberia in the 16th century. But in these histories, what the historians were trying to argue was that, well, every tribe that was in the territory that's now Kyrgyzstan in, say, the 2nd century or the 3rd century were the forerunners of the Kyrgyz people. And they might have fought off somebody who was from the Uzbek lands, again, in the 4th or 5th century. And this was a national liberation movement. Of course, no such thing existed. But the idea was to present a picture of a Kyrgyz state or an Uzbek state that had a home nationality and was surrounded by people who sometimes wanted to do it harm. And even though in the Soviet period, really the ultimate ideology was a friendship of peoples, there was a sense that there was one privileged people in each territory. So you had some sense of building up collective memories among the Kyrgyz, say that the Uzbeks were people that hundreds of years ago wanted parts of their territory and didn't get them. It was subtle, but there was definitely a sense of differentiation and a sense of a little bit of grievance. And most people knew by the 1980s, when Glasnost started to come about and some of these nationalist historians began to escape the Soviet straitjacket and start to talk a little bit more about things like the 1920s when they carved up the Fergana Valley. And so the Tajiks are saying, well, why did the Uzbeks get Samarkand and Bukhara? And the Kyrgyz are saying, well, why did the Uzbeks get Andijan? And so you start to get a sense of differentiation, and you start, at that point, historians are shaping collective memory to really foster national divisions. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the effort redoubled. They're trying, now you can understand, of course, these are new nations, so they're trying to say, this is a history of our new nation, but it really becomes a history of the Kyrgyz people as a privileged people, and all the minorities, it could potentially be problems within it. And this has become more and more an issue today. Well, history has become this broader tool of allowing Kyrgyz to try and understand what it's like to be a Kyrgyz beyond a Soviet identity. So what they've done, both historians and government officials, has gone back to popular folklore. Some of this did exist during the Soviet period. For example, the oral epics, the one called Manas in particular, which is almost like an Iliad or Odyssey, and tried to say this is a root of the Kyrgyz people, this oral epic from centuries ago. So statues of Manas, the great warrior hero, have been erected. And they have tried to make the argument that, again, this is a Kyrgyz nation, and history shows that Kyrgyzstan has always been a very rich country in culture and has always been a place that Kyrgyz have had a claim to. But I think the way history should and can maybe help to address some of these ethnic issues where really the Uzbeks, for example, are written out of the histories, is to try and go back and look at these areas when they were mixed and when ethnicity didn't matter so much to these people and say, look, here's Osh, which was predominantly an Uzbek city, but you did have some Kyrgyz around it. Here's how people work together. Right? Now, there are always conflicts. There are always types of conflicts between groups. If you go back centuries, you'll find incidents. But for centuries, there were times when people of different groups that are now ethnicized today, different villages, they were the same religion, more or less the same culture. They spoke 4 or 5 different languages, and it didn't matter to them. They could communicate. And this pluralism is actually as written into Kyrgyz history as this sort of sense of nationalism. And I think that's a turning point that would be really interesting to try and show, but it would be something that would be very different from what the Kyrgyz are used to understanding their nationality and their territories being. Well, it might be a bit too melodramatic to say that Kyrgyzstan is on a razor's edge in terms of its prospects now. But at the same time, you see some very positive developments, but also some very troubling ones. The positive ones are, of course, after the coup or the revolution in 2010, there really is a democratic vibrancy in Kyrgyzstan right now, and there is a sense that we do not want to return to a time when one very corrupt leader can use the country for his own purposes or his family's purposes. There's a lot of effort into legal reform. There is a sense that Uzbekistan needs to address the ethnic issue in order to prevent a recurrence of the riots in 2010 in Osh. On the other hand, the economic problems are still there. There's been some effort to get foreign trade in, but Kyrgyzstan overall is dependent on very few sources, one of which, of course, is this big Canadian company investing in the gold mine, the Kumtor gold mine in Kyrgyzstan. So without the economic diversity, you have a very high level of unemployment. You have anywhere between 10 and 25% of Kyrgyz working abroad in Russia right now. Now, the money that they send back is very critical for the economy, but that's not a very stable way to run an economy and to create youth unemployment. So all of these economic issues and difficulties underline the fact that Kyrgyzstan has a constant worry about trying to maintain stability. And then you add the ethnic issue. And as aware that the Kyrgyz are, that the ethnic problems need to be addressed, there is still very much a push to make sure that Kyrgyz is privileged. And the latest to come out of these concept papers that the new Kyrgyz government has developed is that Kyrgyz needs to be made the state language of Kyrgyzstan, which causes some issues because, first of all, there's no mention of Uzbek or no mention of language rights. And of course, in Canada, we know how much of an issue language rights has become and how tense that can be. And also, many Kyrgyz are very comfortable speaking other languages because Kyrgyzstan is a small country. If you're in the south and you're Kyrgyz, you may well speak Uzbek because you relate to Uzbek people. Most educated Kyrgyz speak Russian, in fact, are more comfortable speaking Russian because it's their academic and professional language. Younger Kyrgyz are speaking English. So here's this sort of sense where, just one example of where a more pluralistic approach could work in terms of saying, well, Kyrgyz is one language and you can recognize that it has a certain cachet being the titular language, but it's okay to go to an Uzbek school and speak Uzbek and learn Russian, and then maybe have a certain level of Kyrgyz as a second language or something like that. So there's an awareness of the problem. And again, these are new countries, and it's very difficult for us to judge when we are comfortable. Even if something happened in Canada in terms of a breakaway issue, Canada as a country would still exist. Kyrgyzstan, you don't have that feeling. It's surrounded by all these different countries. It's small, it's poor. So the problems are really difficult to solve. And it's really one reason I'm so excited to work on this project with the Global Center for Pluralism, because it's so important regionally and to the people in the country to try and understand how to work together and bring about a sense of pluralism to keep the country from falling apart on the one hand, but just to keep people working together, because then the economy, I think, would take off and all these other issues wouldn't disappear, but I think they would be helped.